The Count of Flanders, Robert II, though slightly younger than his peers, had a stronger and more forceful character. His father, Robert I, had made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1086, and on his return had briefly served under Emperor Alexius. The two remained in contact until Robert I's death in 1093. This connection with Byzantium made it natural for Robert II to take up the cause against the Muslims and participate in the crusade, though his army was slightly smaller than those of Raymond or Godfrey. It was well-trained and of high quality. He was joined by soldiers from Brabant under Baldwin of Alost, the Count of Ghent. During his absence, his wife Clementia of Burgundy managed his estates. From Pontarlier, the combined army of Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy, and Stephen of Blois moved south across the Alps into Italy. In November, while passing through Lucca, they met Pope Urban II, who was en route from Cremona to Rome. The Pope received them warmly and gave them his personal blessing. Continuing to Rome, the Crusaders visited the tomb of St. Peter but chose not to get involved in the ongoing conflict between Urban's supporters and those of the anti-Pope Guibert. From there, they traveled via Monte Cassino to the Norman duchies in southern Italy, where they were graciously received by Duke Roger, Borsa of Apulia. Roger's wife Adela, the former Queen of Denmark, was Robert of Flanders' sister. Roger, acknowledging Robert of Normandy as the head of his family line, offered lavish gifts to his guests. Robert of Flanders, however, accepted only religious relics, strands of the Virgin Mary's hair and the bones of Saints Matthew and Nicholas, which he sent to his wife to be enshrined at the Abbey of Wotton, while Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois opted to winter in comfort in Calabria. Of Flanders pressed ahead. He and his army reached Bari and crossed to Epirus in early December, arriving at Constantinople around the same time as Bohemond. Without any major incident, however, Baldwin of Alost, leading a separate Flemish detachment, attempted to land. Near Chimara, farther south than the usual ports, a Byzantine naval force intercepted them. A minor sea skirmish followed one that Anna Komnena described in detail, especially highlighting the bravery of Marianus Mavrocordacalan, the admiral's son and a personal friend of hers. Despite a Latin priest aboard the Flemish ship fighting fiercely, which scandalized the Byzantines, the vessel was boarded, and Baldwin and his men were taken ashore at Dyrrhachium. Unlike some of the other Crusader leaders, the Flemish made no issue about swearing allegiance to Emperor Alexius. In fact, Count Robert was among those who urged Raymond of Toulouse to follow suit. Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois remained in southern Italy throughout the winter. Seemingly unhurried and lacking the zeal of earlier Crusader leaders, their indifference filtered down through the ranks, and many of their soldiers lost heart and drifted homeward. It wasn't until March that their army finally gathered at Brindisi, ready to cross to the east. On the 5th of April, as the fleet began to embark, tragedy struck. The first ship to set sail capsized and sank, taking with it around 400 people, soldiers, horses, mules, and a large amount of money. In the aftermath, a story spread that the bodies washed ashore bore miraculous marks of crosses on their shoulder blades. While this inspired the devout, it failed to ease the fears of many who promptly deserted the expedition. Still, most of the army stayed together and, after a rough 4-day crossing, landed safely at Dyrrhachium. The Byzantine authorities, prepared and well-disposed, welcomed them and provided a military escort for the march along the Via Egnatia. Apart from a mishap in the Pindus Mountains, where a sudden stream flood swept away several pilgrims, the journey to Constantinople was smooth. After a brief stop outside the gates of Thessalonica, they reached the imperial capital in early May. By this time, all the other crusading armies had already been ferried across the Bosphorus, and the tension that had once marked relations between Westerners and Byzantines had greatly eased. The newcomers were struck by the grandeur of Constantinople, the churches, the palaces, the wealth, and the sophisticated urban life. They were treated generously by the emperor, provided with food, horses, coins, and luxurious silk garments. There, leaders Robert of Normandy, Stephen of Blois, and Robert of Flanders immediately swore the oath of allegiance to Emperor Alexius. In return, they received rich gifts and warm hospitality. Stephen of Blois, a frequent letter writer to his wife Adela, was especially moved. In a letter written soon after their arrival, he described his 10-day stay at the palace with enthusiasm and reverence. The emperor, he said, had welcomed him, like a son, offering him guidance, gifts, and even to educate his youngest child. What impressed Stephen most, however, was the emperor's generosity, not just to nobles, but to the entire crusading host, the thoroughness with which he managed the logistics of the campaign. "Your father, I love," Stephen wrote, referring to William the Conqueror, made many great gifts, but he was almost nothing compared to this man. The Crusader army spent 2 weeks in Constantinople before being ferried across the Bosphorus to Asia. Even this final leg of the journey impressed Stephen of Blois, who had expected the straits to be treacherous but found them no more daunting. Then crossing the Marne, or the Seine, the army moved along the Gulf of Nicaea, passed through the city itself, and joined the other crusading forces already beginning the siege of Nicaea at last. Emperor Alexius could breathe a little easier. What he had hoped for were small groups of professional mercenaries from the west. Instead, he had received vast armies each, one led by its own powerful lords and functioning almost like independent states. No ruler welcomes large foreign armies roaming his territory unchecked, especially when their culture is less refined than his own. It meant that food and supplies had to be secured, order had to be maintained, and internal harmony had to be preserved. Asterisk. The true size of the Crusader forces is difficult to determine. Medieval estimates tend to exaggerate, but even the disorganized mob led by Peter the Hermit may have numbered close to 20,000, including women, children, and camp followers. The main armies, those led by Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, the northern French nobles each, had well over 10,000 people. Bohemond's force was somewhat smaller, but other smaller groups also joined in. In total, between 60,000 and 100,000 Westerners passed through the Byzantine Empire between the summer of 1096 and the spring of 1097. Despite the magnitude of the influx, Alexius's handling of the situation had largely succeeded. None of the main crusading armies went hungry during their crossing of the Balkans. The only serious foraging incidents occurred under unusual conditions: Walter Sands of War at Belgrade, Peter the Hermit at Bala Palanka, and Bohemond at Castoria, whose army had taken a difficult winter route. Minor looting and a few attacks on towns couldn't be completely prevented, mainly due to the limited number of troops Alexius could spare for security, but his use of Pecheneg escorts, though frustrating for the Crusaders because of their rigid discipline, proved an effective policing tactic. His specially appointed envoys also handled negotiations with the Western leaders with diplomatic skill. The clearest sign of his success was the smooth arrival of the final crusading army from northern France, a group known for its poor discipline and uninspiring leadership. Even they passed through the empire without major incident. In Constantinople, Emperor Alexius had succeeded in securing oaths of allegiance from all the Crusader princes, except for Raymond of Toulouse, with whom he had negotiated a private agreement. He harbored no illusions about how faithfully these oaths would be honored, or how trustworthy the princes truly were. Still, the pledges gave him a formal legal advantage that might prove useful later. Securing them had not been easy. While pragmatic leaders like Bohemond and thoughtful observers like Fulcher of Chartres understood the necessity of cooperating with the Byzantine Empire, many lesser knights and common soldiers viewed the oath as a humiliation, even a betrayal. The Crusaders had expected a hero's welcome. Instead, they encountered a cold, indifferent population that clearly did not see them as saviors. When they reached Constantinople, the contrast between their own rough, martial lives and the opulent sophistication of the Byzantine capital was jarring. The city, with its immense wealth, bustling marketplaces, elegant nobles and flowing civilian robes, and aristocratic women surrounded by eunuchs and servants, stirred not admiration but resentment and unease. The Crusaders couldn't speak the language, nor did they understand the customs or the rites of the Eastern Church. They felt out of place and judged provoking contempt in return. The Byzantines, for their part, viewed the Crusaders with distaste. To the citizens of Constantinople, these foreign warriors camped in large, unruly groups outside the city were nothing more than dangerous, uncouth intruders. Even those more sympathetic to the West, such as Theophylact, the Archbishop of Bulgaria, described the trouble the Crusaders brought as they passed through his diocese. In a letter from Achrida, situated on the Via Egnatia, he acknowledged the disruption, but said that he and his people were learning to endure it with patience. These early encounters between East and West did not bode well for long-term unity. Suspicion and misunderstanding ran deep. Yet, despite the cultural clash, Alexius likely felt a degree of satisfaction. The immediate danger to Constantinople was over. The crusading armies had moved on, heading toward Asia to fight the Turks. He genuinely intended to support the crusade, but only insofar as it aligned with the interests of the Byzantine Empire. His loyalty lay first with his own subjects. Like most Byzantines, he believed the survival of Christendom depended on the strength and stability of the empire itself. In that, it was right, no matter how much Emperor Alexius and the Crusader princes might have argued over future claims or how spoils would be divided. There was no disagreement about the initial objective of the campaign, reclaiming Asia Minor. If the crusade was ever to reach Jerusalem, the land route through Asia Minor had to be cleared of Turkish control. This aim perfectly aligned with Byzantine strategy, and for now, with the Byzantine army accompanying them, the Crusaders were willing to follow the advice of its seasoned generals. Their first target was the Seljuk capital Nicaea, situated on the shore of Lake Ascania and not far from the Sea of Marmara. Nicaea was a key fortress. The main Byzantine military road ran through the city, though a secondary route lay slightly to the east. Leaving Nicaea in enemy hands would threaten all communication and supply lines. Moving deeper into Asia Minor, Alexius, aware that summer was advancing, pushed for an immediate campaign. The Crusaders, too, were eager to move forward. In the final days of April, before the northern French army had even reached Constantinople, orders were issued for the forces camped at Pelicanum to prepare to advance on Nicaea. The timing was fortunate. Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslanai had been campaigning on his eastern frontier, attempting to assert dominance over the Danishmend princes in the contested region of Melitene. That area's Armenian ruler Gabriel was actively sowing discord among neighboring rulers. Kilij Arslan, having previously crushed Peter the Hermit's undisciplined mob, underestimated the seriousness of this new crusading threat. Confident the Westerners posed no real danger, and perhaps reassured by overly optimistic reports from his spies in Constantinople, who emphasized the tension between the emperor and the Crusader leaders, he left his wife, children, and treasure in Nicaea. Only when reports reached him of the large Crusader force gathering at Pelican did he realize the threat was real. He rushed to send part of his army westward, following as soon as he could conclude matters in the east. But his troops arrived too late to stop the Crusaders' advance. The march on Nicaea was already underway. Godfrey of Loren's army departed from Pelicanum around the 26th of April and marched to Nicomedia, where it paused for 3 days. There, it was joined by Tancred lending Bohemund's army in his uncle's temporary absence, and by Peter the Hermit with the few remaining survivors of his earlier, ill-fated expedition. Bohemund himself stayed behind in Constantinople a little longer to finalize arrangements with Emperor Alexius for the continued supply of provisions to the Crusader forces. Accompanying the armies was a small Byzantine contingent led by Manuel Budamites. This group included engineers and siege equipment sent by the emperor to support the forthcoming assaults on Nicaea. Made from Nicomedia, Godfrey led the march to Civitate and then southward through the pass, where Peter's undisciplined followers had previously been ambushed and slaughtered. The bones of their dead still littered the pass, serving as a grim reminder. Heeding both the memory of that tragedy and imperial advice, Godfrey proceeded with caution. Scouts and engineers went ahead to clear and widen the track, which was then marked with wooden crosses to guide future pilgrims. On the 6th of May, Godfrey reached the walls of Nicaea. The city, situated on the eastern edge of Lake Ascania, was well fortified. Its formidable walls, stretching roughly 4 miles and reinforced by 240 towers, had been continuously maintained since the 4th century. The west walls rose directly out of the lake, and the city's irregular pentagonal shape made it even harder to besiege. Godfrey encamped before the northern wall, while Tancred took position along the eastern side. The southern wall was left for Raymond's army, which had not yet arrived. Inside the city, the Turkish garrison was substantial, but urgently in need of reinforcements. Messages were sent to Sultan Kilij Arslan, pleading for immediate support. One of these messengers was intercepted by the Crusaders, revealing the city's vulnerability. However, the Sultan's forces were still too far away to intervene. On 16 May, Raymond of Toulouse reached the city and deployed his army before the southern wall, completing the encirclement. Bohemond had rejoined his forces a few days earlier, and thanks to his prior coordination with Alexius, ensured that provisions now arrived regularly by both land and sea. This new supply chain alleviated the food shortages that had weakened the besiegers earlier. When Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois arrived on the 3rd of June with their troops, the full strength of the Crusader host was finally assembled. Although there was no single overall commander, the armies operated cooperatively, decisions made jointly by the leading princes in council. At this point, their unity held strong, and no serious disputes had emerged among them. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexius relocated to Palacanum. From this forward base, he could maintain close contact with both the Crusader camp at Nicaea and the capital. Keeping a watchful eye on the campaign's progress and ensuring steady communication and supply, the first Turkish relief force arrived at Nicaea shortly after Raymond's army, only to find the city entirely surrounded by Crusader forces. After a brief but ineffective skirmish with Raymond's troops, the Turks withdrew to wait for the main army under Sultan Kilij Arslan, which was still approaching from the south. Meanwhile, following Emperor Alexius's instructions, the Byzantine commander Beutamites attempted to open communication with the garrison. When the defenders saw their relief retreating, their leaders invited Beutamites under a guarantee of safe conduct into the city to discuss terms of surrender. He entered Nicaea, but negotiations were abruptly broken off when news arrived that the Sultan and his full army were nearby. Around the 21st of May, Kilij Arslan and his forces launched a direct attack on the Crusader lines in a desperate attempt to break the siege. Raymond's contingent bore the brunt of the fighting, with Bishop Adhemar commanding the right flank. Godfrey and Bohemond, unable to leave their own sections of the walls unguarded, stayed at their posts. However, Robert of Flanders rushed to Raymond's aid, reinforcing the southern lines. The battle raged fiercely throughout the day, but the Turks failed to breach the Crusader positions. By nightfall, the Sultan, realizing that his forces were outmatched in open combat by the heavily armed and disciplined Western Knights, chose to retreat into the mountains and abandon the city to its fate. Asterisk, though the Crusaders had won, the cost was high. Many were wounded or killed, including Baldwin, Count of Ghent. Still, the victory filled the Crusaders with renewed confidence. Their morale soared when they discovered that the Turkish dead carried ropes meant for binding the prisoners they had hoped to capture. To intimidate the defenders, the Crusaders displayed the severed heads of Turkish soldiers on pikes or hurled them over the walls. With the threat from outside lifted, the Crusaders turned their full attention back to the siege. However, Nicaea's defenses proved extremely difficult to breach. Raymond and Adhemar tried to collapse a tower on the southern wall by digging a mine beneath it and setting a massive fire. But the damage was minimal and quickly repaired overnight. By the defenders, even more frustrating was the discovery that the blockade was incomplete. Supplies continued to reach the city via Lake Ascania, which bordered Nicaea's western side. Unable to stop this flow of provisions, the Crusaders appealed to Emperor Alexius for assistance. It's likely that Alexius had already been aware of this supply line, but allowed the Western leaders to come to that. realization themselves, thus reinforcing their dependence on his support. Responding to their request, he dispatched a small flotilla under Butamites to cut off the lake route and tighten the siege. When Sultan Kilij Arslan withdrew from Nicaea, he left the garrison to act on its own judgment, admitting he could offer no further help. Once the defenders saw Byzantine ships arrive on the lake, cutting off their last supply route and realized the emperor was fully backing the Crusaders, they began to consider surrender. This outcome was exactly what Emperor Alexius had hoped, for he had no desire to inherit a city ruined by siege and sack, especially since most of its population were Christians. Only the military elite and a small Turkish court resided there. Butamites reopened negotiations, and terms were discussed. The Turks hesitated, still hoping for the Sultan's return. However, when word spread that the Crusaders were preparing for a full-scale assault, the garrison finally capitulated. The assault was scheduled for the 19th of June, but at dawn, the Crusaders saw the imperial standard flying over the city's towers. During the night, the Turks had surrendered. Byzantine troops, mainly Pechenegs, had entered through the lakeside gates. While it's likely that the Crusader leaders had been informed of the negotiations, they were excluded from the final arrangements. Still, they didn't object. They recognized that storming the city would bring them no lasting gain. Nicaea would revert to the empire. However, the Crusader rank and file were outraged. They had expected to plunder the city and capture Turkish nobles for ransom. Instead, they were allowed into Nicaea only in small, closely monitored groups. The Turkish elite, along with their treasures, were quietly escorted either to Constantinople or to Alexius at Pelicanum. The sense of being denied their due reward intensified resentment toward the emperor. Alexius attempted to soothe tensions. With generosity, he ordered food to be distributed to every Crusader soldier and invited the princes to Pelicanum, where they received gold and jewels from the Sultan's treasury. Stephen of Blois, traveling with Raymond of Toulouse, was stunned by the sheer quantity of gold he received and did not share the outrage of some of his peers. He even defended Alexius's decision not to visit Nicaea in person. Understanding that the city's lavish reception might have placed the emperor in an awkward position in return for their rewards, Alexius required the remaining Crusader knights, who had not yet taken an oath of allegiance, to do so. Many lesser lords, whom he had previously overlooked in Constantinople, now complied. Raymond of Toulouse was not asked for more than his prior pledge, but Tancred was a different matter. Tancred reacted defiantly. He demanded that the emperor's grand tent be filled with gold, in addition to receiving an amount equal to what had been given to all the other princes. When George Palaeologus, the emperor's brother-in-law, objected to his arrogance, Tancred physically assaulted him. The emperor stood up to intervene, and Bohemond, embarrassed by his nephew's behavior, rebuked him sharply. In the end, Tancred reluctantly submitted and took the oath. The Crusaders were deeply disturbed by the way Emperor Alexius treated the Turkish captives from Nicaea. High-ranking officials and military leaders were allowed to purchase their freedom, and most notably, the Sultan's wife, who was also the daughter of the Emir Chukko, was welcomed with royal honors in Constantinople. She and her children were promised safe passage to rejoin her husband, without the demand for any ransom. To Alexius, this was a demonstration of humane diplomacy and imperial grace. He believed in treating a defeated enemy with dignity. But to the Crusader princes, it looked like betrayal. They interpreted such courtesy as weakness, perhaps even treachery. Yet despite their resentment over being denied the spoils of Nicaea, the Crusaders were encouraged by the victory. Letters were sent across Europe proclaiming that this historic Christian city had been restored. News of the triumph stirred excitement throughout the West. More men enlisted, and previously hesitant Italian cities began to offer real support. Within the Crusader camp, morale surged. The nobles were eager to press forward, and Stephen of Blois was so confident that he wrote to his wife predicting they would reach Jerusalem in just 5 weeks, though, he added, "It's with unintended foresight, unless we are held up at Antioch." After leaving Nicaea, Crusader army followed the old Byzantine military road eastward across Asia Minor. This ancient route, beginning at Chalcedon and Nicomedia. Merged with the road from Helenopolis and Nicaea at the banks of the Sangarius River, it then turned south, climbing through valleys and over mountain pass, present-day Biochik before reaching Dorylaeum, near modern-day Eskisir. From Dorylaeum, the route divided into three major paths: the Central Imperial Highway, heading due east across the Halys River. From there, it split again. One road led straight through Sebastia, modern Sivas, into Armenia. The other curved southeast toward Caesarea Mazaka. These led ultimately toward the Euphrates Valley in Syria, or back southwest through the Cilician Gates into Cilicia, the desert route, cutting directly across the arid heart of Asia Minor. Stretched from Amorium, just south of Lake Tata, straight to the Cilician Gates. This route was extremely risky, dry, desolate, and devoid of water, suitable only for light, fast-moving units. The southern road, skirting the desert's edge, it passed through Philomelium, modern Akhir, then on to Iconium, Konya, and Heraclea. Before entering the mountains at the Cilician Gates, this road offered more water and settlements, making it the most practical for a large force. Branches of it led south to Mediterranean ports, one to Italia and Talia, the other from beyond Iconium to Seleucia. These were the options ahead of the Crusaders as they pushed deeper into Asia Minor, into a land still mostly under Turkish control, filled with hazards and far removed from the Christian West they had left behind. Before choosing any of the major roads across Asia Minor, Crusaders first had to reach Dorylaeum, a strategic crossroads on the Byzantine military route. The 26th of June, just a week after the fall of Nicaea, the vanguard of the Crusader army set out, followed over the next 2 days by the rest of the forces. Their objective was to regroup at a bridge over the Blue River, where the road climbed from the Sangarius Valley up into the Anatolian Plateau. A Byzantine contingent, led by the seasoned General Tatesius, accompanied the Crusaders as guides and advisors. Some Crusaders, mainly those wounded during the siege of Nicaea, remained behind and entered imperial service under Butamites, helping to repair and garrison the city. At the village of Luce, near the bridge, the leaders gathered for a council of war. Given the immense size of the army and the difficulty of securing enough food and water along the road, they agreed to split the force into 2 groups to march roughly a day apart. This would reduce pressure on local resources. The first group included Normans from southern Italy, northern French troops, including those under Robert of Flanders and Stephen of Blue, the Byzantines, who would act as scouts and guides. Bohemond of Taranto was recognized as the leader of this forward division. The second group included the southern French, under Raymond of Toulouse, the Lorrainers, under Godfrey of Bouillon, and the forces of Hugh of Vermandois. Raymond was accepted as the commander of this group as soon as the plan was settled. Bohemond's army departed, heading towards Dorylaeum. Meanwhile, Sultan Kilij Arslanai, having failed to defend Nicaea, had retreated east to recover and forge a new alliance with the Danish Mendemir, a fellow Turkish warlord. The fall of Nicaea had deeply shaken him. Not only had he lost a vital stronghold, but also his treasure hoard, which had been left in the city. Still, the Turks were not tied to cities. Their mobility and nomadic warfare gave them a key advantage. The Sultan's real capital, as ever, was his tent. By the end of June, Kilij Arslan was back in western Anatolia, his army now reinforced by both his own warriors and those of his allies Emir Hazen of Cappadocia and the Danish Mend army. On the 30th of June, they were lying in wait in a valley near Dorylaeum, ready to ambush the Crusaders as they descended the mountain pass, vulnerable, divided, and unaware of the danger ahead. That evening, Bohemond's army, the first of the 2 Crusader forces, camped on the plain near Dorylaeum, unaware that the enemy was so close. But at sunrise, the Turks launched a sudden assault, charging down from the hills and unleashing a storm of arrows, shouting their fierce battle cry. Despite the surprise, Bohemond had taken precautions. The non-combatants, mainly pilgrims, were gathered in the center of the camp, where there were natural springs for water. The women were assigned the critical task of carrying water to the fighting men. Tents were hastily reinforced, and Bohemond ordered his knights to dismount. forming a solid infantry defense to absorb the Turkish onslaught. He sent a messenger galloping back to the Second Army, urging them to hurry. He also spoke to his captains, warning them to hold a defensive position and prepare for a hard fight. But one night, the same brash man who had once seated himself on the emperor's throne in Constantinople ignored the command and charged ahead with 40 men, only to be driven back in disgrace, wounded, and defeated. The Turks surrounded the Crusader camp, attacking in waves using their signature hit-and-run archery tactics. Fresh archers would run forward, loose their arrows, and retreat to let others take their place, creating a constant barrage. As the sun rose higher and the heat increased, morale inside the Crusader camp faltered. Surrounded with no way to flee and no thought of surrender, they resolved to die as martyrs if necessary. But just as desperation peaked, around midday, help arrived. The Second Crusader army, with Godfrey of Bouillon and Hugh of Vermandois leading the front, and Raymond of Toulouse and his men close behind. The Turks had mistakenly believed they had trapped the entire crusading force. Their miscalculation shattered their advantage. The two Crusader armies linked up. Encouraged and renewed in strength, they formed a battle line. Left flank, Bohemond, Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois Center, Raymond of Toulouse and Robert of Flanders. Right flank, Godfrey of Bouillon and Hugh of Vermandois is together. Counterattacked, spurred on by visions of victory and plunder. The Turks, likely low on arrows and shocked by the turn of events, began to lose ground. Then, from the hills behind them, came the final blow. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, spiritual leader of the crusade, appeared with a southern French detachment. He had secretly led over the mountains to outflank the Turks, caught off guard and attacked from behind. The Turkish forces panicked, broke ranks, and fled eastward, abandoning their well-stocked camp in their haste. The Sultan's own tent, along with the tents of his emirs and their treasure, fell into Crusader hands. This victory at Dorylaeum, won through endurance, timing, and surprise, marked a turning point in the First Crusade. The Crusaders had overcome a major ambush and gained immense prestige, proving to themselves and to the world that they could defeat the Turks on their own ground. The victory at Dorylaeum was a major triumph for the Crusaders, but it came at a cost. Many knights were killed, including Tancred's brother William, Humphrey of Monte Scabioso, and Robert of Paris. The battle had also delivered a sobering lesson. The Turks were not to be underestimated. Their mobility, discipline, and tactics had tested the Crusaders to their limits. As a result, the Franks developed a reluctant admiration for their enemy. Ironically, this respect for the Turks stood in contrast to their disdain for the Byzantines, whom they continued to see as soft, decadent, and untrustworthy. While the Byzantines had contributed to the campaign, their efforts were largely unacknowledged. For example, the anonymous Norman author of the Gesta Francorum dismissed the Byzantines entirely, while praising the Turks as potentially the finest of races, if only they were Christians. He even repeated a legend popular among Westerners at the time that both Franks and Turks were descended from the Trojans, reinforcing an imagined kinship rooted more in shared hostility to the Greeks than in any historical or ethnic truth. Regardless, Turks' defeat at Dorylaeum had strategic consequences. With his capital Nicaea already lost, and now his army scattered and treasure seized, Sultan Kilij Arslan saw little point in further resistance. As he retreated, he encountered Syrian Turks who had arrived too late to join the battle. To them, he admitted that the Crusaders were too numerous and strong to challenge directly. Rather than risk further confrontation, he ordered a scorched-earth retreat, abandoning or plundering cities, and devastating the countryside to deny the Crusaders food and shelter on their march east. The Crusaders rested for 2 days at Dorylaeum, tending to their wounded and recovering from the intense fighting. Then came the question of which road to take across Asia Minor. The most direct route, the military highway due east, was too dangerous, passing through territory still held by the Danish Mends and hostile emirs. Another path across the central Salt Desert was too barren and perilous for such a large and slow-moving force. Instead, the army chose the southern route, which skirted the edge of the Salt Desert along the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. This road was longer and slower, but safer at least in theory. It was likely that Tatesius, the Byzantine general who still accompanied the Crusaders, advised this course. Still, the journey ahead would not be easy. Decades of war and Turkoman raids had destroyed many of the villages along the route. Crops had failed, wells were dry or poisoned, and bridges were ruined. The locals, traumatized and wary, were often too frightened or too ignorant to offer useful directions. When the Crusaders encountered hardships, they were quick to blame the Greek guides, accusing them of treachery. On the other hand, the Byzantines grew bitter at the Franks' arrogance, indiscipline, and their failure to appreciate the support the empire was providing. In this toxic atmosphere, Tatesius's position became more and more difficult. He was supposed to act as liaison and advisor, but found himself trapped between mutual hostility. With no one fully trusting him, the road to Jerusalem was still long, and already the fragile alliance between East and West was beginning to show cracks. On the 3rd of July, the entire crusading army resumed its march as a single united force. The disaster, narrowly avoided at Dorylaeum, made clear the danger of dividing the troops again. Heading southeast across the Anatolian plateau, the Crusaders could not stick to the old imperial road, which was now unreliable and ravaged. Instead, they turned off after Polybotis, aiming for Pisidian Antioch, one of the few places that had likely escaped Turkish destruction and where they could still find food. From Pisidian Antioch, they crossed the barren ridges of the Sultan Dock Mountains and rejoined the main road at Philomelium. The country beyond was harsh and lifeless. The searing summer heat made every step a burden. There was no water except the briny marshes of the central Anatolian desert, and no shelter or shade, only thorny scrub, which starving men tried to chew for moisture. Along the route, the ruins of old Byzantine cisterns taunted them, remnants of a once well-maintained empire, now deliberately wrecked by the Turks. The horses were the first to suffer. Many knights had to walk, and others resorted to riding oxen, or even hitching dogs, sheep and goats to drag their baggage. Yet the army's spirit endured. As Fulcher of Chartres noted, the shared struggle brought together warriors from many lands and languages, unified not just by purpose, but by what he saw as divine inspiration. In mid-August, they finally reached Iconium, modern-day Konya. Though Kilij Arslan would later make it his new capital, at that moment the city lay abandoned. The Turks had retreated into the mountains, carrying off all portable wealth. However, they couldn't take the natural riches of the place. The green, fertile valley of Merom, with its flowing streams and orchards, provided a long-overdue haven for the Crusaders. The army rested in Iconium for several days, taking in food, water, and some peace. It was a badly needed respite. Many were exhausted, and some leaders were seriously unwell. Godfrey of Bouillon had recently been injured by a bear during a hunt. Raymond of Toulouse had fallen gravely ill, believed by many to be on his deathbed. He even received last rites from the Bishop of Orange. But the rest and healing air of Iconium revived him, and he was able to continue the march before leaving. The Crusaders listened to the advice of local Armenians, who told them to carry enough water for the next leg of the journey across another arid stretch till they reached the fertile valley of Heraclea. With renewed strength, the army moved forward, ever closer to its holy goal, but not yet beyond danger. At Heraclea, Crusaders encountered a Turkish force led by Emir Hazen and the Danish Mendemir. These leaders, worried about defending their lands in Cappadocia, may have hoped that by confronting the Crusaders here, they could pressure them into taking the more dangerous southern route across the Taurus Mountains toward the Mediterranean coast. But instead of hesitating, the Crusaders, led by Bohemond, launched an immediate assault. Bohemond even sought out the Danish Mendemir personally in the heat of the battle. The Turks had no appetite for a pitched engagement. They quickly retreated north, leaving the surrounding towns open to the Crusaders. That night a comet blazed. Across the sky, a sign many saw as a heavenly endorsement of their victory. With Heraclea secured, the leaders had to choose their next move. Just east of the city lay two possible roads. The Cilician Gates route south. This road crossed the formidable Taurus Mountains through the Cilician Gates, a narrow, treacherous mountain pass. Beyond lay the hot, disease-prone lowlands of Cilicia, still in Turkish hands. Even if the Crusaders managed to push through, they would still have to face another difficult crossing the Syrian Gates in order to reach Antioch. Strategically, this route was shorter, but it was considered extremely dangerous, especially for a large and slow-moving army. The Caesarea Marish route, east and north, this option took them eastward to Caesarea Mazaha. Then along the old Byzantine military road over the Anti-Taurus range to Marash, Germanicia. And finally, down through the Amanus Gates, a far more accessible route into the Antioch plain. The terrain here was less threatening, and crucially, the region was dominated by Armenian Christian lords, many of whom still regarded the Byzantine Emperor as their overlord and were thus likely to welcome the Crusaders. The Byzantine general Tatesius and his advisors almost certainly recommended this safer northern route. However, not all the Crusader leaders agreed. Tancred, ever suspicious of Byzantine motives and reluctant to follow imperial guidance, argued for the southern road. He was joined by Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, and together they took a splinter force of Normans, Flemings, and Lorrainers. Choosing to strike out through Cilicia on their own, the main army, under the majority of the princes, chose to follow the road to Caesarea, marching east into safer Christian-held territory. This divergence would mark a critical moment in the crusade, setting up competing conquests and laying the groundwork for the political fragmentation of Crusader ambitions in the region. Around the 10th of September, Tancred and Baldwin departed separately to cross the Taurus Mountains, while the main Crusader army marched northeast toward Caesarea. On the way, at Augustopolis, the Crusaders encountered and defeated Hazen's forces again. However, not wanting to slow their advance, they chose not to besiege a nearby castle, instead occupying several small villages. These were handed over to a local Armenian lord named Simeon, who agreed to hold them as an imperial vassal, reaffirming ties with the Byzantine Empire. By late September, the army reached Caesarea, only to find it deserted by the Turks. They passed through without stopping and continued on to Comana, modern-day Placentia, a town inhabited by Armenians and under siege by Danishmen Turks. The arrival of the Crusaders caused the Turks to flee without a fight, and although Bohemond pursued them, he failed to catch them. In Comana, the people welcomed the Crusaders warmly, showing continued cooperation between the Franks and Byzantines. Tatesius appointed Peter of Alps, a Provencal knight and former Byzantine servant, as the town's governor, and the emperor's Nema, move that reassured locals and kept imperial influence intact. The army then marched to Koxan, modern Gaixon, another fertile Armenian town at the foot of the Anti-Taurus range, where they rested for 3 days and replenished supplies. Spirits were high when a rumor reached the Crusaders that Antioch had been abandoned by the Turks, with Bohemond absent. Still chasing the Danishmens, Raymond of Toulouse seized the initiative, perhaps prematurely, without consulting the other princes. He sent 500 knights under Peter of Castellon to race ahead and occupy Antioch. However, as they approached a Paulician-held castle near the Orontes River, they discovered the rumor was false. In fact, Turkish reinforcements were streaming into the city. Peter of Castellon wisely turned back, but one of his knights, Peter of Rho, broke off with a few men and, with support from local Armenians, captured forts and villages in the valley of Rusia, near Leppo. While it's unclear whether Raymond intended to claim Antioch for himself or simply sought the glory and spoils for being first, his unsanctioned move alarmed Bohemond when he returned. The incident deepened suspicions and rivalries among the princes, highlighting the growing fractures within the Crusader leadership. Even before reaching their next major goal, the march from Koxan was the hardest ordeal the Crusaders had yet faced. By early October, autumn rains had begun to fall, turning the roads across the Anatolis Mountains into dangerous muddy tracks. The path was narrow, winding over steep inclines and beside sheer cliffs. Horses slipped and tumbled too, their deaths dragging entire lines of pack animals with them. It was too treacherous to ride, so even the knights had to walk, weighed down by their armor. Exhausted, many tried to sell or abandon their weapons, too weary to carry them. More lives were lost in the mountains than in any battle with the Turks. At last, the Crusaders descended into the valley of Marash, greeted again by a friendly Armenian population. The town was ruled by Thetul, a former Byzantine official, who was confirmed in his position. The Crusaders rested for several days. Bohemund rejoined them after his failed pursuit of the Turks, and Baldwin arrived from Cilicia to be with his dying wife, Godvir. After her death, he soon left again, now with his sights set eastward. Around the 15th of October, the refreshed and reorganized army resumed its march, moving down from the mountains into the plains of Antioch. On the 20th of October, they reached the Iron Bridge, just a few hours from the city. It had been 4 months since the Crusaders had set out from Nicaea. A grueling journey through scorching summer heat, treacherous terrain, and territory under constant threat from swift and elusive Turkish forces. Their progress was driven not only by religious faith and a burning desire to reach the Holy Land, but also by the hope of plunder, land, and glory. Their achievement was impressive, and some credit must be given to the Byzantine support especially. The guides and officers like Tatesius, whose knowledge of Asia Minor and experience fighting the Turks was vital. Despite some missteps such as the dangerous route from Koksan to Marash, the Byzantines had done much to keep the expedition on track. Without their help, the Crusaders may never have made it across Asia Minor, although suspicion of the Greeks lingered among the lower ranks of the Crusader army. Cooperation at the leadership level remained stable at least until they reached the walls of Antioch, where the next chapter of conflict and ambition would begin. While the Crusaders pressed forward toward Antioch, Emperor Alexius, I focused on strengthening and securing the territory behind them. Since he was responsible for keeping communications open across Asia Minor, his goal was to consolidate Christian control in the Crusaders' rear and guard their supply lines. The initial Crusader victories had forced the Seljuks and Danish Menza previously divided into an uneasy alliance, creating a renewed Turkish threat in central and eastern Anatolia. To counter this, Alexius aimed to secure the western half of the peninsula, where his growing naval power could support sustained control. He began by refortifying Nicaea and reinforcing key fortresses along the road to Dorylaeum. Then he launched a combined land and sea offensive to reclaim the Aegean coastline. He dispatched his brother-in-law, Caesar John Ducas, supported by Admiral Kazbaks and the Byzantine fleet, to reconquer Ionia and Phrygia. The main target was Smyrna, still held by the son of the late Turkish emir Chaka, who also controlled Lesbos, Chios, and Samos, and whose vassals ruled over cities like Ephesus. In a shrewd political move, John brought with him Chaka's daughter, the Sultana, whom Alexius had treated with honor since capturing Nicaea. Her presence may have been used as leverage. Facing this overwhelming force, the emir of Smyrna surrendered, on the condition he and his sister could retire safely eastward, after which he vanished from historical record. Victory followed quickly. Ephesus fell with minimal resistance. As Kazbaks reoccupied the coastal towns and islands, John Ducas marched inland, taking the Lydian cities of Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. By late autumn 1097, the entire province was under Byzantine control. The next step was to advance into Phrygia, once winter passed. Alexius's strategy likely aimed to reopen the old road running from Polybatis and Philomelium down to Italia, from there along the coast toward the east. Sea power would protect this route, and it would connect with the Armenian lords holding the Taurus Mountains. This would establish a secure supply corridor to support the Crusaders in Syria and ensure that the broader Christian campaign against the Turks could continue effectively. It was a carefully planned effort to stabilize Asia Minor, outmaneuver Turkish counterattacks, and maintain momentum in the Holy Land.